The 20th Century War between the Western European powers, which began in earnest in 1914 and halted after 4 bloody years of fighting, resumed again officially in 1939. Following the swift occupation of Poland by Germany and the USSR, Britain and France declared war on Germany, but limited their actual fighting to leafleting and a few naval skirmishes. In May 1940, however, Germany broke the deadlock and invaded France through the Low Countries and forced Paris to capitulate in 5 short weeks. Tonight, as continuation of our ongoing coverage of the World at War series, we discuss episodes 2 and 3 on the British and French perspectives at this time, as well as the diplomatic context in Europe that does not neatly fit into the hero-villain narrative as often portrayed in Allied historical accounts.
September the 1st, 1939. Germany attacks Poland. Adolf Hitler ignores Britain and France, which had promised to fight for Poland. Sunday, September the 3rd. The British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain broadcasts.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Hello, and welcome back to our ongoing series covering the 1973 British propaganda film, The World at War. Today we will be discussing the second and third episodes of the series, Distant War and France Falls. They're covering mostly 1939 to early 1940. And I wanted to briefly begin with something that the series skips over, which is the entire diplomatic and political history of the 1930s. I believe the only thing you really get out of it is a quote at the beginning saying that Germany attacks Poland, Adolf Hitler ignores UK and France, which had promised to fight for Poland. It skips over quite a bit, and this one of the most enduring myths of the conflict is the myth of Polish victimhood, when in fact what we should really be talking about is Polish aggression. And I know it's a very unfortunate series of words, whether it be in English, German, or Russian, but it's always a difficult and unfortunate time when you have to say we need to talk about Poland.
Well, it's also if you don't mind me insinuating real quick, Poland was they were under the rule of this crazy military junta that was violent. It was unstable. It was ethnically cleansing Germans, Russians, Jews, Ruthenians, anybody they decided they didn't like. You know, this was basically a failing criminal regime that was overtly quote anti-Semitic. So that this idea that, you know, Poland was this marvelous democracy and the Germans just tore it apart because they couldn't stand, you know, some sort of alternative modality on the frontier, that's especially preposterous. And of course, you know, weeks subsequent, the Soviet Union assaulted and occupied eastern Poland, and that apparently didn't bother the crown or the French at all. I mean, like, so that it's okay if Poland is assaulted as long as the men, you know, so deployed or arriving from the east and have little red stars on their hats. Is that it? This has never been clear.
Nor did it bother any history teacher I ever had, because it's something my entire life it's always thought was very bizarre. And it's no wonder that the documentary skips over this history, because it does not. It's a Jewish British series, and it does not. The history, the facts would not paint the UK in a good light, and they haven't. Thomas is exactly right as to the nature of what the Poland entity, if you will, was at the time. And I have to say, in revisiting this history, I was struck by the noticeable similarities, and they're very ironic similarities, but is often the case in history, between the situation with Poland and that we're seeing now with the Ukraine and Russia. There's
absolutely
a lot of similarities, particularly the suppression of minority populations, in this case, German, with violent persecutions. There were even reports, there are corroborated reports of like 5 castrations that took place. I mean, they were doing a lot of very brutal stuff, and they were trying to expropriate a German farmland. I mean, basically, at the same time that their country, which was illiterate and poor, they were funneling all this money into military stuff, which is very similar to the Ukraine. It was existing as a form of a tripwire for the benefit of the great powers and the game that they were playing. You had those areas that were minority areas when they were subject to a referendum or democratic to a vote. They voted to join Germany, as did the Russian-speaking areas in the east of the Ukraine. A lot of interesting parallels. And I would say, also, yeah, please go ahead.
No, I mean, tremendously so. And point that out to people, you know, and both these regimes were and are basically criminal. And it's also something, you know, it's never, why is the Polish state this like sacrosanct thing? You know, like no one can explain that. And to be clear, you know, the German Reich, this was their proposal to Poland. They asked to have dedicated access to Danzig and, you know, free rights of ingress and egress from the port of Danzig. But they said that, you know, it could remain under Polish control so long as they had dedicated access, and they wouldn't attempt to interfere with Polish sovereignty. And they asked for, you know, some kind of mutual defense pact contra the Soviet Union, which was in Poland's interest. So, I mean, basically, Poland could only benefit by cooperating with the German proposal. And what their response was, you know, irrational hostility, a British war guarantee that was meaningless other than to provoke a wider conflict in event of hostilities. Like, how exactly could the British defend Poland? I mean, you know, that's a laughable prospect. But also, it's a rare, Poland, like Ukraine in the present, is a rare case of naked irrationality in high politics. Like, the Polish notion was they were going to defeat the German Reich occupy, its easternmost frontier, prevent it from reconstituting, and then fend off the Soviet Union indefinitely. I mean, that's preposterous. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the other interesting parallels, the pretense of negotiations when they actually had no interest to negotiate at all. And Hitler's position was nothing but overtures towards diplomacy and peace up until 1939. And as Thomas said, just to clarify further, what the German proposal was an Autobahn and rail through the Danzig corridor to East Prussia, and then Danzig itself would be under German sovereignty. And the thing about that is that it wasn't even administered. It was basically the Polish customs people that they had, who were criminals, right? That's what they were doing, is they were expropriating. But it was nominally under the League of Nations, Danzig, which Danzig was 96% German. And so
it made no sense. Go ahead.
Well, and the concessions are remarkable, which is that the Reich would forfeit Upper Silesia, Posen, and West Prussia, which had been German for hundreds and hundreds of years, which would also abandon over 1 million Germans to Polish rule, as well as sign a 25-year non-aggression pact. And this position of Hitler's was very unpopular amongst the party and even the German people, because they were hearing. So Hitler actually had to order newspapers to suppress reports of some of the atrocities that were being committed against Germans.
That's important. Just to insinuate real quick, it's similar to the situation in Tyrol, which, the German Reich ceded to Italy, and that was hugely unpopular. This idea, Hitler went to bat for the Sudeten Germans in a big way, but that also had geostrategic importance. But this idea, Hitler wasn't just this guy he did a lot of really unpopular things, particularly as relates to the national question in the interest of broader, geostrategic imperatives. So this idea that he was just this cynical, German nationalist who was just trying to stir up this kind of aggressive fervor among German-speaking populations to finagle some sort of fledgling mandate like that. Actually the opposite is true, when he did a lot of really unpopular things. Yeah, 100%.
And as mentioned, the guarantee given by the UK is what really emboldened the Polish entity. And so I just want to quote from Hitler after the agreement. He's addressing the Reichstag, and he says, "This obligation contradicts the agreement I previously made with Marshal Pilsudski, since the 1934 agreement only takes into account obligations already in existence at that time, namely Poland's commitments regarding France. To belatedly expand these commitments is contrary to the German-Polish non-aggression pact. Under these circumstances, I never would have concluded this pact back then. For what sense does it make to have a non-aggression pact if it leaves a number of exceptions for one partner practically wide open?" So I wanted also to add that when the Soviet-German non-aggression pact was established, there was a hope that this would show the Poles what few cards that they had to play, and that it would make them more sympathetic to actual negotiations. And as Thomas was saying, there was this irrationality because part of what they had done with their internal propaganda was stir people up to such a point where they couldn't even back down had they wanted to. And so when the agreement was made, the Poles did not change their approach at all.
Yeah, and it's something important too, and we can bring it back to the Polish situation in a moment, but we can think of kind of the start of the record of diplomacy, of European diplomacy in the 1930s. It's kind of commencing in 1933. I mean, for obvious reasons, and back then, that's when Mussolini was. I mean, Mussolini was kind of viewed as this heroic figure, and even a lot of progressives liked him. both in America and in Europe. And Mussolini's big kind of diplomatic coup was the Four Powers Pact, which it was never ratified um, by the French, but all four signatories, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, and Germany, there was a move towards collective security within Europe that undid the more egregious conditions of the Versailles Treaty. And then this was followed on by the 1935 Anglo-German Naval Treaty, and the British Admiralty of all actors explicitly stated that the restrictions upon German on the German war navy is unconscionable, and Germany has to be able to defend herself. So this idea that there was some kind of peace consensus, but the Germans were going crazy and just undermining it, like, that's preposterous. And there was really up until 1938, there was a move towards collective security, however symbolic some of these efforts may have been, and that's important because that the way the strategic environment and the diplomatic kind of culture is characterized is totally wrong. I just wanted to insinuate that.
Yeah, and it's also relevant to today. There's a lesson from this, which is when you have these, and the UK hasn't really changed in its behavior since the 1930s, where when you deny the legitimacy of a power's security concerns, you're making conflict inevitable.
Well, yeah, exactly. And that was I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but that was really the issue with Czechoslovakia. I mean, Czechoslovakia is a contrivance. It was a completely artificial state. But in the era of nascent air power, I mean, basically it guaranteed that Berlin was going to be annihilated immediately in event of war. Czechoslovakia was only devised basically as I think Goering described it as, like, a knife pointed at the heart of the German Reich. This kind of bad faith diplomacy, this claim that it's illegitimate for any state to object to the territories being gerrymandered to act as basing platforms for hostile forces, a handful of kilometers in comparative terms from their capital cities. Like, this is preposterous. And stuff like that precludes actual negotiation, because it makes a deliberate mockery of it. It's a kind of gaslighting, really, I think.
Well, much of the Versailles Treaty was clearly designed to weaken the former German Empire, I guess the Second Reich. And if you look at the Polish portion that used to be Germany, that used to make up approximately 25 to 30% of the German Empire. And to put that in context, if you think of the United States as a region, a political entity, just carve off the entire Midwest and expect people who used to live, there as Americans, and expect them to become part of Canada or whatever new country that is now part of, and not have a grievance 10, 20 years
later. Or just
later.
tell Texas, or just tell Texas, oh, you're part of Mexico now, like, deal with it.
Yeah, well.
Yeah, and to complete the analogy, you would also start ban English language schools, as they did in Poland.
Yeah, exactly. And
German language.
Yeah, I mean, people would go utterly berserk if something like that was even suggested here. And it's that's an important I mean, this is a bit of a tangent, but it's relevant to the posture of the pre-New Deal federal government. Wilson is kind of villainized, not just by, like, libertarian types, but by a lot of, like, old right type guys and a lot of revisionists. Wilson, he threw his hands up at eventually, and and was beside himself because it became clear that the British and the French delegation, they had absolutely no interest in collective security. This was a way of just carving up the former German Empire and the former Ottoman Empire, and finding a way to enrich themselves at the expense of their vanquished enemy under this kind of preposterous claim of moral superiority over the vanquished. And that's whatever Wilson's faults, whatever his blind spots, that's not what he wanted. And nobody.
A quote from Wilson. Wilson said, "The only real interest of France in Poland is in weakening Germany by giving Poland territory to which she has no right."
Yeah, Wilson was a flawed guy and a flawed president, and the degree to which he allowed financial capital interests to hold sway over the White House, and these characters like Colonel House who were able to kind of insinuate themselves into their role of minister without portfolio. I mean, that was unconscionable too. But making a villain of Wilson, I think, is misguided. And this idea that the American delegation was somehow responsible for the architecture of the Versailles Treaty. That was nonsense too. But yeah, it's conspicuously absent, not just in the world at war, but in pretty much every treatment. AJP Taylor's book stood out so much because, among other things, I mean, he presented what was a very controversial thesis for the time, and to some degree still now, on the causes of the conflict. But about half the book is dedicated to the failure of collective security efforts in Europe from 1933 onward, and how these things were really deliberately sabotaged. Not just by the war party in the UK, but really by a constellation of bad actors. That's why Rod Dreher says all kinds of idiotic things. I mean, I think he's quite literally like mentally ill. But he published some idiotic op-ed the other week talking about how, quote, crackpots are being given access to mainstream platforms, and among other insane claims of these people is that the British were somehow in the wrong leading up to World War II. It's like, so why now the British are they're as infallible as Jesus Christ or something? Like, I don't like, how are you a crackpot for criticizing the war party in Britain? I mean, it's basically anybody who knows the subject matter finds all kinds of reasons to find fault with that regime. It's really somewhat indefensible. Like, even if you don't have anything, even if you don't believe that the Germans had any legitimate claim of a sovereign right to act as they did, when confronted with the ongoing security quagmire in Europe. Why it just goes to show you the degree to which this is basically like a faith-based like moral paradigm that these people promote. Like, I mean, really Dreher is like a literal mental case, but what he's parroting is what basically has been the attitude of court history. It's literally immoral to criticize the British war party for reasons no one can really articulate, because it's a faith-based enterprise.
Yeah, they don't, because the facts aren't there. I mean, and the Germans were certainly aware of the dishonesty of English diplomacy. They had fairly good intelligence, and a lot of their communications were intercepted, and they knew that essentially they were just buying time, that the pretenses of negotiations were really just a way to stall for time as they prepared their own military.
Well, it's also too,
they were building up throughout the 30s.
No, 100%. And I think I can't remember the context that we were discussing it um in, but a friend of mine, when we were recording some content the other week, he made the point that in a lot of these treatments, the world at war included, but in there's myriad other examples, it's as if the Soviet Union just didn't exist. This juggernaut um, state that covered a substantial portion of this planet, that was building the mightiest military apparatus the world had ever seen, that had exterminated around 10 million people before a shot was fired in the Second World War. It was animated by this revolutionary doctrine of of global of global liberation, from the oppression of industrial capital, as they viewed it. I mean, everything, you can't talk about the 20th century without, I mean, everything in the 20th century was in dialogue with Soviet power in high, in terms of high politics and strategic questions. And
Well,
no, go ahead.
well, and what Hitler wanted was not a war with the Soviet Union. By this point in the 30s, what he wanted and the goal of this diplomacy was to establish a collective security against Soviet subversion of the countries bordering Germany. That's what he was concerned with. He knew that he didn't want to engage in a full war at that point. He had wanted to when it was weaker, but by the time, after the First War, but by the time that the communists had consolidated power, he was not looking for this war. What he wanted was an agreement among Western nations.
Well, also, like, something Brendan Sims, who's written a really great biography of Hitler, and that was published around 2021. He makes the point a lot that Hitler thought like a European. This Hitler wasn't a German nationalist. And that's why the ethos of the Waffen-SS was very much kind of in line. The reason why it developed the way it did, and by cessation of hostilities, had over 1 million men under arms, uh, about half of which were non-German, was because Grossraum Politik was the future. And that was Hitler made the point again and again that the future is America, and Europe needs to adapt or die to this reality. It'll either be subsumed by nascent superpowers. It'll continue to lose its most talented and vital population to America. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union will just crush Europe, either by direct military intervention, or just by becoming so singularly powerful that Europe loses any capability to act independently of Soviet will. There was nobody in the German Reich thought that cabinet warring or petty national statism had any future. Nobody thought
Hitler
that.
was undoubtedly the first real statesman of the 20th century.
Absolutely. In terms of how he campaigned, in terms of his view of geostrategic questions, 100%.
Meanwhile, these adversaries are still operating under 19th century assumptions. And where was England after the war?
Yeah,
Where was the
100%.
empire?
Yeah, yeah. And it's so, well, that was also even if that was kind of Mosley's point. I mean, Mosley was a complicated individual in all kinds of ways, but that Mosley wasn't just some lackey of the German Reich or the NSDAP or something. His view was, we can stand with Europe or we can become airstrip one. And lo and behold, that's exactly what happened. You don't you don't destroy your country and become an American aircraft carrier because the Germans are bad guys. That's not that's not how politics works. You know.
Yeah, Mosley is. I mean, Yaki, Jean Thierry. They saw this as that was Europe's chance, was to create an actual European empire.
And a superpower, yeah, exactly. And that's why, I mean, these things endure. I mean, that's what's fascinating about. I mean, conditions are very different, and the 20th century was anomalous in all kinds of ways. But something that doesn't change is Europe's only path to liberation and to sovereign independence in political and strategic terms is deep interdependence with Russia. And that's exactly why the regime is so desperate to preclude that. You know, it and
With
that
Russia,
was yeah,
as well as a relationship, be it maybe one of colonialism or at least one of good diplomacy with North Africa, which is also what they
yeah,
destroyed with Gaddafi.
yeah, very much so. And that Europe's in very. I don't want to hijack the conversation, but yeah, Europe's in grave trouble right now. But that, but that's yeah. But to bring it back, you can't talk about you can't talk about the 20th century without you know talking about the Soviet Union and the impact of its great power potential on the strategic environment. And it's even in conceptual terms too. I mean, even long after revolutionary communism like ceased to be impactful in kind of first world societies, during the mid Cold War, it was still this tremendously vibrant, animating principle in the third world. And in the later Cold War, like the third world is what mattered because that's what was going to tip the strategic balance towards what configuration globalism was going to take. So this idea that, the Soviet Union was just kind of this irrelevant second-rate superpower, or that, oh, well, after World War II, communism was that's just something those paranoid McCarthyites like to bandy about. It's there's a real illiteracy there, and I realize in some of these treatments of the lead up to the Second World War, it's very deliberate, because to acknowledge to acknowledge the Soviet threat and to acknowledge this, in conceptual terms again, like how this revolutionary imperative that had literally transformed the world and extinguished millions of lives. The degree to which this shaped the psychological environment, it really can't be overstated. So talking about talking about the conflict in the West and in some splendid isolation. I mean, don't get me wrong. Like, I'll hear the case. Some people have made the case that France obviously was overrun and lost the war in 1940. And to be fair, I mean, modern combat resolves rapidly. The French actually fought really hard, and the Wehrmacht absorbed about 40,000 KIA in weeks. Okay, the French fought as well as can be expected, but there's some historians, including some revisionists, who argue that, well, like 1939-40 was like one conflict. The British lost at Dunkirk, and the only path to victory for the German Reich, like Endsieg, was the defeat of the Soviet Union. So then the German-Soviet War jumped off, and Churchill and the War Party saw a way to basically like liquidate their country and their empire to avail themselves as a client of the United States, and therefore like carve out some kind of stake in the post-European world. But basically, 1941 to 45 was Germany / Axis Europe, the nascent superpower, versus the extant superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And there's something to that. Okay. My perspective is a little bit different than that, but that's totally different than just redacting the Soviet Union as the key kind of strategic and conceptual factor as of the 1930s. If that makes any sense.
It does, and to help those who are not as steeped in the history as both of you are, to also use the context of the world at war for those that are trying to follow along. Let's go through the sequence of events that the series presents in these second and third episodes, and then let's have you guys comment if that's all right. So the first part,
Yeah.
It's called Distant War. It basically picks up obviously after the first episode, and this being the second. It talks about when Germany invades Poland, and it touches upon the fact that the USSR invades shortly thereafter, but it doesn't explore it obviously very much for reasons you guys have cited. But that was in September the 3rd, 1939, and this was actually only about a week after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had been signed between the Germans and the Russians, which was obviously for strategic reasons and led directly to them both agreeing to take the western and eastern parts of Poland respectively. Now, what's interesting is that both Britain and France declare war simultaneously against Germany, but not Russia, as you guys have pointed out. And then ensues a sort of very weird period. Many have called it the phony war or the Sitzkrieg, where basically nothing happens. And then eventually the Germans have had enough, and then they just take over the western part of Europe, which only takes them about 5 weeks. They go through the Benelux countries, Belgium, and the Netherlands specifically to get around the Maginot Line, and then they take over Paris, and then France capitulates. And that only took about 5 weeks. And then after that, it's basically Britain and Germany fighting this kind of very tepid war where the Germans push out the expeditionary force that had landed in Europe from the UK onto the mainland of the continent. They push them out at Dunkirk. And then what ensues is basically a series of naval battles and air battles. And then it gets into the prolonged Battle of Britain, and we'll cover that in our next part of the series. But within that context, I think the series does an okay job of going through some of the more interesting and deeper history aspects of the Maginot Line, what it was like sort of for the French people and the British people going through all this. Did you guys review the episodes? Was there anything that jumped out at you from the testimonies? Anything that you wanted to comment on in those sort of contextual sequences?
Yeah, just briefly, and yeah, I'm deliberately not going to comment on the Battle of Britain because that's a huge subject that's important to the series and the tenor of the series. So we'll save that for next episode. But the one thing I think that they did convey fairly well, um, you know, the British had no capability, extent, or potential to project power into Central Europe and somehow assault the Wehrmacht to, quote, defend Poland. The entire, in there's really no such thing as a good bluff in war and peace terms, unless your bluff is such that you can get your enemy to capitulate without firing a shot. And that's exceedingly rare that those conditions ensue. So this idea that, the war guarantee was some kind of deterrent, it's like, well, what possible deterrent could it be? Like what British forces exactly were going to deploy to defend the Polish frontier? It didn't make any sense. And that's one of the reasons why the German street, as it were, was basically, solidly behind not just Hitler, but the party. in the entire affair because they viewed themselves as being availed to a totally irrational mode of aggression that couldn't even be substantiated by an actual deployment. I mean, so again, it begs the question, how do you negotiate with an opponent like that? Um, and I think it conveyed somewhat of the irrationality of the entire affair. Um, and kind of the surreal nature of it, because this went on for months. Like this state of war, but where there was no war because, and again, too, it was Britain and France who declared war, while having no meaningful ability to deploy forces in theater. And of course, in the case of the French, their notion was we're going to declare war and then like invite some sort of attrition battle. It's like, okay, well, then why did you declare war? I mean, nothing about it made any strategic sense.
Well, there was sort of a very meta observation that I had about the different sides that I thought that actually the series captured somewhat well, was the lack of enthusiasm on the side of the British and the French regarding this conflict. There were a couple of interviews that were done with the British and French interviewees, and they both basically said that nobody was volunteering. They would basically do it if they were called only, and then those that were sitting there on the Maginot Line or whatever were reluctant to even fire a shot. And it was more or less like, I don't really want to antagonize these guys because I don't want to actually be shot at myself. It was purely from my interpretation, admittedly, but it was purely a conflict between the British and French governments against the potential rival of the Germans. It had nothing to do with the people, from everything I gather. So I thought that was important to note. And the Germans,
definitely.
The Germans, on the other hand, were actually very motivated because they had lost substantial amounts of territory and national pride, and financially as well, with all the burdens of the reparations they were having to pay. And so they were actually much more gung-ho than the French and the British. But yeah, the British and French were.
I posit too, and there's a historian named Chris Bellamy who, in some ways, it's kind of like an old. I mean, he's a younger guy, but in some ways, his perspective is kind of like that of an old school Tory. But he's very good with kind of coding variables in terms of painting a conceptual picture of the military situation, about the Western and the Eastern Front, and the conditions leading up to the onset of hostilities. He makes the point that the French never really recovered from the Great War, like the Germans did. France absorbed huge casualties, and they didn't bounce back really demographically, but they didn't bounce back like spiritually either. I don't think, when their heart just like wasn't in it. And again, make no mistake, when war did arrive, and the Wehrmacht finally assaulted across the Low Countries, I think the French army fought, valiantly. But this idea that the French state would be able to mobilize, a couple million men who would then, be hyper motivated to assault the German Reich and, try and carve out some kind of new strategic paradigm, and absorb like 500,000 casualties or something. That was not realistic. I don't think. I think Bellamy made that case pretty well.
I just wanted to add a little bit more context and share an observation that Richard Tidor made, which regarding the Danzig question, as I mentioned before, Danzig was 96% German, and they had their local Senate was German. So they could have, the National Socialists could have ordered them to make a declaration to provoke a Polish military response if they wanted to pursue first a military solution to the problem. Because had they done that, yeah, I thought it was a very good point because I hadn't considered this. That would have given them the right then to intervene, under democratic principles, right, of self-determination or what have you, because And the Germans historically, they've always struggled with those types of manipulations that English are much better at. The Germans.
It would have been like a repeat of, or it would have been like a parallel, like the Sudetenland situation. But yeah, no, it's fascinating,
Right.
man. Go ahead.
Exactly. Yeah, I just wanted to share that. And overall, just my final point on the diplomatic situation is there were so many off ramps that were provided towards de-escalation and diplomatic solutions, and it was at great cost to Hitler, as far as the opinion of the party and public opinion, that he pursued diplomacy up until the very end.
And for context too, and I don't want to. I mean, by the situation by 1940 was very different, but Jodl at Nuremberg, he stated that he became a true believer in the Führerprinzip as well as Hitler's claim to leadership after the Munich crisis was resolved in Germany's favor. But Jodl said he was convinced that Germany would lose a general war with Czechoslovakia in 1938. To be clear, like the Skoda arms works were probably second only to Krupp. And the Czechoslovaks had a very tough and well-equipped army, and the terrain of Czechoslovakia, particularly on the frontier, was very difficult. And the Germans didn't really have some great combined arms capability. Like I think we talked about last week, they didn't even reach a full mobilization footing until 1943, when, in my opinion, they were actively losing the war. And there's this kind of misconception that the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS and the Luftwaffe was like this super high-tech force or something, and that was not the case at all. And it was low-tech. It was, compared to the American army, it was pitiably poorly equipped, not in terms of the quality of equipment, in terms of scarcity. German infantry was told, like the Germans were amazed that the U.S. Army infantry would basically walk and fire and like dump ammo into everything. They basically like advance while like firing into the tree line. The Germans were like, we're told like not to squeeze that trigger until like we're on target. Meanwhile the Americans, they, it's like to them like ammo grows on trees. The German army was not equipped to wage some like mass campaign and overrun Czechoslovakia with combined arms and endless artillery shells and everything else. And Jodl said, he's like I was gonna try and convince the general staff to place Hitler under de facto arrest and put the brakes on the assault order if we'd gone to war in 1938. So there wasn't there's a few things you can extrapolate from that. Like, first of all, there wasn't this German war machine that was capable of singularly facing down Europe. And secondly, the German Reich was a house divided, not just within the party, but between the party and the military establishment. And it was this constellation of characterized by tension, that made up the coalition on Hitler. This is key, man. In understanding the internal environment within the Reich and the internal situation always impacts decision making in critical capacities, and nowhere is that more evident than in war and peace decisions.
Should also like to emphasize the fact when it comes to propaganda attempting to portray Hitler as a warmonger, Hitler was somebody who saw war as much as saw modern war as much as someone could have seen it, and fought honorably in it. When you compare him to these politicians, these warmongers who are completely removed from it, he understood the consequences of war, and he didn't want Germany to be thrown back into it.
No,
Spec-
exactly. I mean,
Specifically,
go ahead.
he was in the trenches and he got gassed, where he lost his eyesight for a period of weeks, I believe. And when you said he saw a war, he literally lost his sight because of it. And I think it's one of the reasons they actually never used chemical weapons during the war. And that point has been made many times, but I think it's important to emphasize.
Yeah, no, most definitely. And it's also the yeah, pretty much. I mean, the entire general staff and the entire officer corps, had cut their teeth in on the battlefield, and a tremendous amount of men. I mean, basically everybody other than guys who'd been too young for the draft by the time of the armistice, and men who were comparatively elderly. Pretty much every man had served in some capacity. Yeah, this idea that and I mean, Germany had been under starvation blockade, for close to 2 years after the war, and then they'd been suffering under the weight of this punitive treaty that was basically a looting operation. The German body politic knew better than anybody what the kind of hardships and suffering that attends war, and the Hitler's mandate exclusively came from his ability to index with the body politic. It didn't come from anywhere else. It didn't come from Hitler wasn't some conquering hero. He wasn't some aristocrat who had a gift of being able to relate to the common man as European political cultures transition to this kind of like age of like mass procedural democracy. So this idea that Hitler and the Germans were just these like obsessed belligerents, who wanted to wage war at all costs. Like, that's really quite preposterous.
Well, the series touches upon Dunkirk a little bit, and I think, disappointingly doesn't acknowledge the fact that the Germans effectively let the British and a few French forces leave without being shot at back to the UK.
Because
I mean,
at that
I think
time, he
virtually
still
nobody
believed
understands.
in
Yeah.
pursuing diplomacy with the UK.
Well, I think virtually nobody understands just real quick, the Westphalian Convention like ruled the day. It's this idea that it would, like, regardless of, I mean, even somebody who has a very punitive view of the German Reich, this idea that the Germans just strafing and machine gunning a defeated, retreating British army, that was just not the kind of thing that was done. People would have found it shocking and unconscionable, and frankly outside the bounds of decency. I mean, we'll get into this. I don't want to. This becomes particularly relevant in the Battle of Britain, but yeah, it's not. The Germans were abiding what was convention. Europeans don't. I mean, you don't treat people within your own civilization. You don't avail them to that level of unrestricted violence. That's what had reigned for 300 years. It wasn't like anomalous or weird. And people seem unable to come to terms with it.
Well, to Nick's point, many have argued as well that the restraint shown by the part of the German military, which had effectively pushed the entire French and British up until the tiny northwest corner of France to Dunkirk, was being done on the behest of Hitler in order to effect a peace treaty. I think that's
that too. Yeah. No, definitely. Well, there's myriad examples. It wasn't von Thoma, but it was it was some Wehrmacht general officer of a similar kind of pedigree. Like he famously like saluted like the defeated French garrison in some town that they'd overrun. And he's like, we're not going to humiliate these people. We're going to treat them like men. And famously, I mean, Hitler wasn't happy with the way the Italians botched the assault on Greece. I mean, Hitler wasn't happy that the assault on Greece happened in the first place because it completely screwed up the kind of delicate balance in the Balkan theater. But so I mean, so there's a lot behind, there's a lot of bad feeling behind, the necessity in Hitler's view of invading Greece. But he made the point too, like, treat these people with respect. They're the heirs to a great civilization, and we're not going to treat them. We're not going to treat them like our enemy. And that was I mean, juxtaposed especially with the war in the East, which was of a totally different character. I mean, this is important. It wasn't the Germans that broke the Westphalian precedent in the West. I mean, like I said, I want to reserve discussion of that until the next episode because that's when it becomes particularly material. But yeah no, that's you guys are absolutely right.
But before actually the fall of France, the Germans had embarked, as well as the British, on capturing Norway, and the series touches upon the Battle of Narvik, which was a Norwegian port, I think active to this day, that is very important for export of Swedish iron ore during the winter, which is obviously essential to any war operation that needs iron for its steel mills to make tank bodies and artillery shells and whatnot that are made out of steel. And this was a vital strategic supply line for the Germans that lacked a good source of iron, or a sufficient source of iron for their war and armaments industries. And I actually had to look into this because I was a little bit confused, because Norway and Sweden actually used to be the same country about 200 years ago, but they broke apart. And the Swedish, however, have a tremendous wealth of minerals, and then the Norwegians obviously have the benefit and the wealth of the oil in their fjords and whatnot. But the Narvik connection is interesting because the Swedish, being on the eastern side of that peninsula and having access to the Baltic Sea, not understanding the sort of the geography or the climate differences, I thought that basically all that the Germans would need to do is have access to the Swedish side. Well, it turns out that during the winter, the Baltic Sea basically freezes. And the reason the Norwegian side doesn't, even though it's latitudinally very similar, is that the Gulf Stream flows up literally from the Gulf of Mexico / America, depending on how you're calling it, and it moves up north to the North Atlantic, and it warms those countries by at least 10 degrees during the winter. And so it actually keeps Narvik free of ice, and it allows you to send iron ore out of there. So that was the whole reason. The whole reason they invaded Norway was basically for the iron ore. That was it.
Well, also the British were planning to assault through Norway and then strike at Germany.
And Finland
from the north.
I think they were actually trying to get Finland to join with them against Russia, which was weird because then they flipped over on that. And so it just goes to show you how these alliances were alliances of convenience, not morality. But go ahead, please.
Yeah, Narvik was what Erhard Milch. That's why he was promoted to Feldmarschall. Because it was basically like the Luftwaffe relieved the German army at Narvik, which was surrounded, and the Luftwaffe like literally carried the day. And this was like the finest hour of the Luftwaffe. And Goering gave Milch theater-wide command, because Goering figured there's probably 100-to-1 odds against this succeeding. And better Milch, who had a contentious relationship anyway, better like Milch kind of goes down in flames than myself. But and then if Milt succeeds, it's like, well, I'm the one who, assigned him to the command. So then, like, I look like a hero. And sure enough, yeah, that exponentially improved the Fuhrer's confidence in the Luftwaffe. It made Erhard Milch a field marshal, and it was really it was really a catastrophe for the Allies.
Yeah,
That was also in the
and it
yeah,
led
go
to
ahead.
the ousting of Chamberlain, arguably, because
Yeah.
it was under him and Churchill, who was the Lord of the Admiralty, but it was under Chamberlain's headship that they lost that battle, and that's due to a variety of logistical mistakes. I mean, they didn't have enough ski troops, they didn't have a sufficient schedule to get all the soldiers into place at the right time, and the series covers that to a degree. But yeah, the political activities in the Allies and the democracies, as they were deeply affected by this, and it actually flipped over the leadership over to Churchill.
Yeah, no, it's and that yeah, that is a strength of. I mean, that's one of the strengths of the series. To be fair, there are some strengths to it, and yeah, stuff like the Battle of Narvik is I mean, anybody who's got a strong research interest in the Third Reich is going to have read extensively on the Battle of Narvik, but it's not something that features heavily in kind of general accounts from the Allied perspective, and the World at War deals with that pretty in pretty serious depth, as well as some of the battles in the North Atlantic. And you guys mentioned that at the outset of our discussion.
Well, the series mentions
yeah.
somewhat briefly the British and German navies fighting, I think, in the South Atlantic, because it was centered around Montevideo, which is in Uruguay, and it was between, I can't remember the Royal Majesty's ship name, but it was that versus the Graf Spee, and the British actually sunk the German battleship. And to give the British some credit, they did actually fairly well on the water. Their navy was arguably the best fighting force in that entire war.
No, the British Service Navy was rivaled only by the Japanese, and they that's also why Rader got sacked, because Rader was a surface warfare admiral, and Donitz said, "This is a fool's errand to try and challenge the Royal Navy on the surface. Like, our only hope is the U-boat fleet."
Right.
And there was some precedent for that, like the Kaiserreich had a U-boat fleet that they employed later in the war to great effect. I mean, by that point, it was too little, too late, and there wasn't the petrol to power these submarines. But that's basically these catastrophes of the Royal Navy, obliterating these German battleships, is what led to Rader being sacked in favor of Donitz. And I think Donitz, other than Chester Nimitz, I think he was the greatest naval commander of the war. But yeah, no, go ahead, buddy.
Well, there is a very good part in the World at War that covers the U-boat, however you're going to say it, depending on your language, battle. And Dönitz was highly featured and interviewed, actually, in that episode, yep. which was really interesting. And I think at the end of the war, after Hitler had resigned, so to speak, he became the head of the government, and he's an interesting guy.
It's important.
Go ahead.
No, it's an important nuance to Donitz's succession. No, Donitz was a real hero, and even the British Admiralty, they a lot of powerful men objected to him being tried, because he was an honorable man and a great naval commander. But it's fascinating that Hitler in Hitler's last will and testament, he named Donitz as the president of Germany. And the office of the president, the Reichspräsident, had been abolished um, incident to the emergency that also led to the Enabling Act and the renewal of the Enabling Act periodically. So basically, Hitler was saying with his death, the office of Fuhrer, first of all, that office can't be transitioned to another man because it's the result of an emergency which, owing to total defeat, no longer exists. And, only by act of the body politic through their representatives in the Reichstag can such a status be invoked. But also, Hitler believed, obviously, that Donitz was a man the Allies would negotiate with in good faith. It's that cuts against this idea of Hitler being this carpet chewing, astrology obsessed, like buffoon who was out of his mind in the final days of the war. That actually suggests a remarkable kind of cold rationality, considering the circumstances and the fact that he was about to die. I mean, that's why there's Hitler didn't appoint a party man, or he didn't appoint somebody like Himmler, or some general who could be implicated in some of these excesses that the Allies were claiming were the exclusive domain of the Germans and the German land forces in particular. So I don't think it's just I don't think I'm just focusing on this unduly and assigning a significance to it that isn't there. I think the appointing of Donitz held a lot of significance.
I can't remember where I saw it, but it was over 10 years ago, and there was an estimate of the IQs of the German high command, and Hitler had like 140, and Goering was right up there, and then I think it was Dönitz that had the highest.
So. I think it was Hjalmar Schacht, then Donitz, and at Nuremberg they tested all the detainees. They gave them all IQ tests. That's where that data came from. And yeah, I think it was Hjalmar Schacht. Hjalmar Schacht and Donitz might have been tied.
Interesting.
And then like Raeder was up there. I think Julius Streicher was the lowest, but also Streicher was something of a crazy man. So like he might have like spoofed it and like, I mean, who knows? But it, but no, Donitz's autobiography is really fascinating. I highly recommend it. And speaking of Erhard Milch, he was a great man and a real hero. And he had an odd. He also was the founder of Lufthansa. So he was the first commercial aviation executive. He was a brilliant field marshal. His father was Jewish. So Milch was in this, and I mean, he wasn't raised in the faith of the culture or anything, but it was an open secret that he was Jewish. And after Ernst Udet's suicide, Milch really did what he could to salvage the Luftwaffe. Udet's kind of a sad case. He was a hero, an ace from the Richthofen squadron, and he had a very sad post-war life. And Goering was very personally loyal. Whatever else can be said about him, he gave Udet a role in the Luftwaffe that was really beyond his abilities. The combination of that and Jaschanek, who really was Jaschanek really was a bad guy, kind of like a caricature of a Prussian martinet who, it was the kind of toxic combination of Jaschanek's short-sightedness and Udet's unsuitability for the role. It led to some real disastrous decision making. But I'd say that the fact that the Luftwaffe was as effective as it was, even late in the war, when it was, engaging in these kinds of desperate defenses of Berlin, immediately over the target area and stuff with what remained of their fighter fleet. That was all Erhard Milch and Hajo Herman. But any event, David Irving's book, The Rise and Fall of the Luftwaffe, that is an all but name, like the memoirs of Erhard Milch, because Irving, he quite literally looked up Milch in the phone book in the Bundesrepublik, and then elderly Milch in the 70s, he was like living with his niece, and so Irving just went and knocked on the door, introduced himself, and the niece was obviously suspicious because she's like, "What do you want with my uncle? Like,
Right.
is it?" And Irving managed to win her trust, and then him and Milch became like buddies. So for like 2 years, every week, Irving would go to Milch's niece's house, and like he'd sit down and like talk to Milch, and it's fascinating. It's a great book, and like I said, Milch is kind of a hero of mine, and just like a fascinating, really, really remarkable guy. So I highly recommend that book. That was a bit tangential.
No. Credit to Irving for actually doing real historical research. That's how you do it. You actually go to the source and interview and look at the documents. And he's
people
talked about that.
No, people also forget, or they neglect, or they probably haven't even read it. His book on his book on Dresden. Bomber Harris helped him write that book. So you get these bizarre, crazy people like Mrs. Lipstadt saying, "Oh, well, that book's been discredited." It's like, really, that the man who ordered the attack is discredited because some crazy Zionist lady says so. Like, really, like that. How? Well, like, who then is a credible declarant? Like it. But yeah, no, and the Destruction at Dresden is a great book too. That we can get into some of that. We get into the episodes that deal with the area bombing. But that's I think that's about all I got, man, for this episode. I'm chomping at the bit to talk about the Battle of Britain, but I want to hold off on that to next episode.
Well, last thing I'll sort of bring up for you guys to riff off of is I mentioned before we started, I went through the 4 hours of The Sorrow and the Pity, which is this kind of weird documentary of the French who lived through the Vichy France period. And I didn't really know what to make of it other than it was kind of an interesting slice of different parts of French society and what different aspects of them were feeling and doing at the time. I did take away from the fact that because they were interviewing so many different types of people, from the bourgeois to the farmer to the intellectual and whatnot, the French really were sort of a divided people. And I think as the World at War covers in their third episode, France Falls, they didn't really have the will to power to really to fight against the Germans, and many of them actually welcomed it. And the movie series The Sorrow and the Pity, which is 2 parts, it touches upon that quite a bit. And they had many people in the series who were either resistance fighters, but also were in the Waffen-SS, doing things in the Eastern Front, who were part of the French Fascist Party, for whatever that's worth. I thought it was very interesting to see that. And Nick, if you're still on the call, maybe you can speak to that, because there were some people who were part of that occupied / Vichy France component of the French society that were not necessarily opposed, not on the resistance side as the stereotypical Hollywood portrayal of the French were, and that kind of dumb movie Inglourious Bastards sort of portrayed, but also were in favor of the Germans. And I don't know if you guys have anything briefly.
France is a strange thing. It's been many years since I saw that movie. I probably will never watch it again. We mentioned briefly when we talked about this beforehand, one of the things about France after the war is it is such a sharply divided society politically, and they the persecution that came with collaboration with the National Socialists was very extreme. I mean, they executed Robert Brasillach for really nothing more than speech and writing. I would point to maybe even figures that I'm sympathetic to. I will say I am sympathetic to Dominique Venner. He's a very good writer, but it's a very confused thing where French chauvinism gets in the way of the bigger picture in a major way. Because in the case of Venner, he was supportive of the Vaughn's plot against Hitler, and he was very much anti-Hitler, but at the same time, he was an unapologetic supporter of French Algeria. I mean, he even volunteered as a young man to go fight there, and he would be considered by liberals to be essentially a Nazi.
Well, and that's what's key, is that a lot of these guys who were anti-Hitler, they were anti-Hitler because they were French fascists. And like Darlan, who Roosevelt had a big problem when it came out that the administration was trying to basically buy off Darlan, and he was the French military overlord or procurator, whatever, of French North Africa. And he was an open fascist. And when it came out, a lot of Roosevelt's enemies are like, why are the New Dealers negotiating with this fascist bastard? And for context, Operation Torch, when the U.S. Army landed in North Africa, it was French troops that engaged them. Okay, so this idea that like France was this it was ruled by social democrats who hated Nazism, and then there was this stalwart resistance that loved America and Britain. That could not be farther from the truth. And even to Nick's point, even a lot of these guys who were anti-Hitler partisans, they were basically Action Français types, who had a chauvinistic view of Francophone politics, and that's why they didn't like Hitler. It's not because they were a bunch of social democrats. And plus too, I mean, yeah, France was a hugely divided society. The communists refused to fight because the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was operative. You had a strong contingent of French National Socialists. The final defenders of the Reichstag in 1945 was 33rd SS, which was a French division. So it's complicated, and but that's, I mean, there was that guy who he's got a YouTube channel called Military 1945, and he releases these newsreels that came out of the propaganda ministry, and these newsreels were broadcast all through Axis Europe, in Italy and Slovakia and Croatia and in Norway, in France, in Spain and Portugal, which were sympathetic to varying degrees, although that's a complicated issue too. But I mean, there was an Axis Europe, this was not something that was just artificially imposed in all these countries. In some instances it was, but in most it wasn't. This was a European-wide movement. It's the European Civil War, the Europäische Bürgerkrieg is what Nolte refers to the conflict as, and that's accurate, in my opinion.
The German triumphal parade followed the exact route of the French victory procession after the First World War. It had taken the Wehrmacht just 5 weeks to humble their historic foe. In the words of Winston Churchill, the Battle of France was now over. The Battle of Britain was about to begin.